In a major development in the Israel-Hamas war, Israeli forces have entered the southern Gazan city of Rafah in an operation they say is aimed at destroying Hamas targets. For the 1.4 million people in Rafah, this presents yet another major challenge, with many having nowhere to go.
Okay, Sam, so it's been 8 months now since October 7 when Hamas launched an attack on Israel. And Israel's focus now has turned to the city of Rafah, which is in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Before we get to Rafah, though, can we go back and can you just quickly give us a high-level explanation of what has happened in the last 8 months?
Sure. So on the 7th of October, 8 months ago, as you say, Hamas, which Australia lists as a terrorist organisation, launched an attack on Israel. Now, according to data cited by the United Nations, roughly 1,200 people were killed in that attack. Hamas captured about 240 hostages and 133 remain captive today. Israel responded by declaring war and bombarding Gaza, and according to data cited by the UN, more than 34,700 Palestinians have been killed since the 7th of October. Now, significantly to this story, Israel's war in Gaza has caused a humanitarian crisis. And importantly, as well to this story, at the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, the Israeli military's focus was on the north of the territory, cities in Gaza like Gaza City and Jabalia. And the IDF ordered civilians in Gaza, in those areas, to flee to southern areas of Gaza, including areas like Rafah and a city called Khan Yunis.
Right, so when Israel declared its war on Hamas in Gaza, its focus was in the northern parts of the territory, and it told civilians to flee south.
Yeah, and they did exactly that. So they moved south, and as a result, 1.4 million people are currently sheltering in Rafah and an adjacent refugee camp to avoid the violence. And just to give you some context on Rafah, Rafah is approximately 64 square kilometres.
That is really, really small.
It's tiny, and if you break that down, that means there's nearly 22,000 people per square kilometre, and that makes it one of the most population-dense locations in the world. There's also huge humanitarian significance to Rafah. The city is a critical point of entry for trucks that are delivering humanitarian aid from Egypt via the Rafah crossing. So on one side of the Rafah crossing is the city of Rafah, and on the other side is Egypt. And both those parties have worked out a way to get some aid into the Gaza Strip. Now, the reason why it's significant to Israel is it's really the only area in the Gaza Strip today that is still controlled by Hamas forces. So according to the IDF, Rafah is where Hamas are launching attacks towards Israeli soldiers from, and where there is still a network of tunnels that could potentially be used to hold some of the 133 hostages.
And we've been hearing that there could be a potential invasion by Israel into Rafah for some time now, right? I remember a few months ago we did a podcast when the Australian government warned Israel against invading into Rafah.
Yeah, and it's kind of been this looming idea surrounding the conflict in 2024, really since the turn of the year. So that was in February, that warning from the Australian government. Anthony Albanese put out a statement warning against the invasion, saying it would be catastrophic. And those warnings have been echoed quite widely. And earlier this year, the UN Children's Agency, UNICEF, warned a ground invasion in Rafah would bring, quote, catastrophe on top of catastrophe. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also previously said an assault on Rafah would end up, quote, killing thousands more civilians and forcing hundreds of thousands to flee.
Okay, so just to recap where we are, Rafah is right now home to 1.4 million people, many of whom have fled from the northern part of Gaza to escape Israel. And Israel has been warned many times against invading Rafah from the international community, including Australia, who have said that doing so would significantly worsen the humanitarian crisis already unfolding in Gaza.
Right.
However, Israel says that Rafah is where Hamas is partly operating from.
Exactly.
So when did the IDF decide, after all of these months of it potentially being an option for them, when did they decide to enter the city?
Well, it kind of all happened on Monday, and that's when senior Israeli ministers approved a plan for the country's army to move into Rafah. So about 100,000 civilians were told by the IDF. They dropped pamphlets from planes, and so there was footage of kind of paper lining the streets of some parts of Rafah to evacuate. And they were told to evacuate to 2 nearby cities in southern Gaza, Al-Mawasi and Khan Yunis, which I mentioned before. However, according to the Red Cross, and this is a really important point, there is no room for the 100,000 people in the areas that they have been told to flee to. And that's a direct quote from the Red Cross. Then on Tuesday afternoon, Australia time, the IDF confirmed it had taken control of the Gazan side of the Rafah border crossing. Remember I said there was a border shared with Egypt. It said it had struck about 50 terrorist targets in eastern Rafah and eliminated 20 terrorists. The IDF also said it had uncovered 3 tunnels being used by Hamas in Rafah.
And the United Nations has been the key body that we have relied on for information about this war. What have they said about Israel's move into Rafah?
Hello, I'm James and I produce the video you're watching. If you're enjoying what you're watching, we'd love it if you considered subscribing and checking us out on our other platforms. It'd really help in getting the word out about what we're doing here at TDA. Thanks very much, and now back to the deep dive.
Well, the UN Secretary General, so kind of the CEO almost of the organization, Antonio Guterres, warned Israel against broadening the operation. He said a full-scale assault on Rafah would be a human catastrophe, countless more civilian casualties, countless more families forced to flee yet again with nowhere safe to go.
And that's an idea that keeps coming up, that Israel is asking, hundreds of thousands of people to move, but a lot of, the Red Cross before and the UN has said that there is nowhere safe for these civilians to go. And
of particular significance to those organisations is the effect that it's having on the influx of aid into Gaza, specifically into the south of Gaza, where now a majority of the population is. And that's relating to that Rafah crossing, that key entry point shared with Egypt that the Israeli Defence Force now has control over.
So we've covered how the United Nations has responded to this. What about the political community? What have they said?
So this week, Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong met with her New Zealand counterpart to discuss a response to the Rafah operation. We don't have a statement from that call just yet, but a few days ago, Wong said Israel, quote, should not go down this path, and that Israel is, quote, gravely concerned with the prospect of a military move into Rafah. And then if we look overseas, the US is Israel's closest ally. And US President Joe Biden spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier this week, so just before the operation started, and warned him against launching an invasion into Rafah. National Security spokesperson John Kirby had this to say at the White House press briefing yesterday.
We've made clear our views about operations in Rafah that could potentially put more than 1 million innocent people at greater risk. During his call with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the president again made this clear. He also made clear that we continue to believe that the hostage deal is the best way to avoid that sort of an outcome while securing the release of those hostages. And as I said, those conversations continue.
Now, another significant development from the US side of things is that senior US officials have told the Associated Press that the country has paused a shipment of about 1,800 bombs it was sending to Israel over its concerns with the operations in Rafah.
And this is all happening against the backdrop of there being ceasefire negotiations happening right now in Egypt, right?
Yeah, and that's quite a remarkable set of circumstances to consider, that on one side of the border you have this unfolding military situation. Just on the other side of the border, there's a negotiating table where Egypt and Qatar are trying to bring together a solution to this conflict and kind of reach a ceasefire as quick as possible.
So they're acting as kind of mediators to Israel and Hamas to come up with a ceasefire.
Exactly. And shortly after Israel indicated it would enter Rafah on Monday, Hamas declared it would agree to a variation of the latest ceasefire deal proposed in Egypt last month. So they rejected it last month. They said they'd agree to it with some variations earlier this week. But a statement from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said, quote, the Hamas proposal is far from meeting Israel's core demands. Israel has now said it'll send another delegation to Egypt to go back to the negotiating table to work towards what it describes as an agreement on terms acceptable to Israel.
A very complicated topic that is rapidly unfolding. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Daily Aus, and we hope to see you again tomorrow.